Welcome to Contemplify, where we seek to kindle the examined life for contemplatives in the world. I'm your host, Paul Swanson. Today, I welcome poet Todd Davis to talk about his latest collection of poetry, Ditch Memory, New and Selected Poems. This is Todd's third time on Contemplify. And like the previous conversations, we find our charge in the sacred strides of cultivating attention. The poetry of Todd Davis stretches me and helps me scratch the dirt of what is real, to taste and to relish my short passage through this world. I think his poetry will do the same for you. As always, you can visit Contemplify.com for the show notes on this episode and learn more about Todd Davis at ToddDavisPoet.com. Now join me in raising a glass to my guest today, Todd Davis. I had a doctor's appointment this morning, just an annual physical, and I brought your collection just as I knew I was going to wait. I even thought, maybe I'll read a poem to my doctor, because I just thought that'd be a great break in her day. But it's my first time meeting her, and she had the bedside manner of like a bedpan. Like, I was just like, I really should read a poem, but there's no opening to like have a human connection. I just came from, and my previous doctor who retired, he had the warmth and the expertise. And I was just like, it was kind of jarring because like, yeah, this is a great way to start a relationship with a doctor. I'll read a poem, but no such luck today.
I don't know if you know Cav and Carey Press in New Jersey. They publish a lot of wonderful books. But one of the things that they've done over the years, and I had a brief nonfiction piece in it, is called The Waiting Room Reader. And they distributed this book, this anthology, to waiting rooms across the Northeast for free. And gorgeous poems, gorgeous nonfiction pieces, so that you're not having to read People magazine.
That's a brilliant idea. And what a gift to the community that doesn't even know that it wants it. We're all sitting there thinking about death anyway, or thinking about our health. Like, why not read something that's got a little oomph to it?
Yeah, a little depth, as opposed to the bad TV up in the corner and the awful magazines to flip through.
That's it. Todd, I'm thrilled that we're here again to talk about your work. There's Saturday Night Live that has the 5-Timers Club. You are the second person to be in the 3-Timers Club here, and it's an esteemed company. And I really, I love inviting you back and being in these conversations because your work is a companion to my life. And I don't know of a bigger gift, hopefully, to give a poet and writer than to say that these live with me. These aren't things that I discard between conversations, but your poetry has a plumb line that goes to the depth of my being, and I get to walk around with that in between. So I have nothing but gratitude that we have this chance to connect again. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. And yes, that is the best gift you can give to a writer, for sure. And I find it fascinating because there are those poets and those poems that I revisit daily in my mind. And it's not that I've memorized them. I know some people do that, but it's not that I could recite them from memory. But an image, a line, the emotion that is carried in the poem will come to me.
Yeah. I'm right there with you. And it is one of the hopes of this meager little podcast is that can be part of what inspires folks, is to find their poets, to find the lines, to find the lyrics, whether they be mystical or they be a pop singer, but something that cuts to the core of one's being. Let's begin by, I want to ask, where am I finding you today? What is the location of yourself here today? Where are we finding you?
I still live along the Allegheny front between the villages of Bellwood and Tipton. Game lands 158 and 108 are the state game lands. They comprise over 41,000 acres of public land. There are no maintained trails in them. And so those are the places. And so from where I'm sitting right now in my office, as the crow flies, you're all of about 2 miles from the start of those game lands.
Mm.
And the little Juniata River runs behind the neighborhood where our house is. And there's a protected wetlands just last night. We had a long, cold winter. It really hung on, and we're still not with our normal average temps. But the spring peepers and the wood frogs were going crazy in the wetlands last night. So I stopped and listened to their chorus.
That's how I want to close every Sunday evening, I think, to have that chorus of frogs.
No better choir. I like a good boys choir. I belong to a Mennonite church, but I'll still take the wood frogs and the spring peepers each time.
That's marvelous. One thing, as we were setting up our time for this conversation, you mentioned that you had a birthday coming up. And so 2 days ago, you turned 60. And you shared that you share a birthday with your son, who was born on your 30th birthday. So you are now 60. Is it your oldest son then?
Yes, Noah.
Your oldest son is 30. And birthdays, can be more than just markers of number of times around the sun. What came up for you as you reached 60, looking back from this birthday, not only at yourself, but also your progeny following behind you?
Yeah. So many emotions. As you know, having spent time with my poems, mortality is something that comes up in my poetry again and again. Not unique to me, but definitely is something that is stuck with me. My maternal grandfather died when he was 62. I was not quite 6 years old. He and my grandmother were moving from a factory town in Connecticut. He had really had a terrible life in terms of his physical condition because he was a working alcoholic. He had smoked his whole life. So he was retiring from a rubber factory, working the line, and got to Elkhart. Literally was in our house maybe 3 hours. We took him to the hospital, and the next morning he was dead. And so
wow,
from that event on, the notion of death and how to navigate the relationship with our mortal bodies and the fact that we are always living and always dying at the same time has been a consuming part of my life. Hopefully not a debilitating, but a consuming part of it. And so, Noah was born on my 30th birthday and maybe distracted me from that milestone. And so Shelly and I drove up. My son and daughter-in-law, Nakia, they lived in Missoula, Montana for 4.5 years, but she finished her PhD and is now on a postdoc at UMass Lowell. And so we drove up and met them in Sheffield, Massachusetts. And Noah and I went brookie fishing and hiking on our birthdays, our shared birthdays. And for both my sons, Noah and Nathan, one of the biggest ways that we are together, and it's very similar to the way I was with my father and with my grandfather, my father's father, we just were in the woods, noticing things around us in the woods and noticing things about each other and speaking those things aloud to each other. And a lot of my poems, I think, come out of that act of noticing, being present to what's there and then speaking to them, but then trying to listen back. What are they speaking back to me? And so that would be human and non-human life. And that includes laughing and making fun of what's there too, including being 60 and having less hair on the top of my head and the diminishment. Obviously, I was a college athlete and I tried to stay very fit, and I did play competitive basketball right up to 47. Probably 7 years longer than I should have, but I wanted to play with both of my sons in competitive leagues, and so we did. And so you just notice, no matter what you do, to try to stay healthy. And I try to do that so I can do my field research in pretty wild places, including in Montana. But just the diminishment. And the sad part, on the day, well, I guess it was Thursday. So 2 days before my birthday, I had to take our cat of 16 years to the veterinarian to be euthanized.
Oh, no.
And that was tough on the whole family. She was a deep companion. The nature of my job, especially writing, she would be here with me all the time. She also slept with me for 16 years by my side, tucked closely. And again, animal intelligence, animal sentience, animal emotions are something that I'm very interested in. And so losing the personhood of that cat was difficult.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. What was the cat's name?
So the cat was my youngest son, Nathan's 11th birthday present. So he got to name her at 11 years old. So Whiskers.
Whiskers.
Not the most original name, but the name she got. And we all called her just Wee or Wee Babe. So there was this, when we would just call her Wee, the family really did coalesce around her. So many of our actions. And so there was not only WHI, like her shortening her name, but WE.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so sorry for the family's loss. And knowing your poetry and sensitivity to the more than human world, I can only imagine how dear we was to you and the family. Yeah. That's a loss for sure. How are you all grieving that? Do you have rituals that you have done as a family through other losses like this?
So I'm thankful for this form of technology. FaceTime, we get together and so, yeah, we've shared a lot of tears with each other. Shelley and I driving up to Sheffield, Mass and back, shared stories about Whiskers, and then being with Noah and Nakia, we told stories. Our youngest son is a professional basketball player, and so he's living in Australia.
Wow.
And that has been very difficult for him because he feels like he missed being able to comfort her into her death.
Yeah.
But we have FaceTimed with him. And so, yeah, just tears and reminiscence. And being in the house, though, every time I come around a corner where she would normally be, or her normal patterns of behavior, which included getting in and out of bed with me 3 or 4 times a night, waking me for a moment when she'd get back in, and insisting with her muse to have my hand raised so she could run her sides of her chin right across there each night. All those things are being missed.
Yes. My youngest child still finds the most opportune moments nearly every night to wake up and sneak into our bed. And I'll wake up sometimes with an elbow in my eye, or they have long blonde hair that will just be like draping over my face. And there is something about the creatureliness of together and bumping into each other as you're just looking for that much needed rest, whether it's animal or child or partner. The creatureliness, I can never get enough of. It's a joy. Like, I know that this season will end where they don't do that as often or at all. But I'm kind of soaking up the last of it with them in particular.
It is as precious as it comes. And I think we've talked before, I think of poetry as one of the most bodily literary arts, that it's oral, out of the mouth, O-R-A-L, and oral into the ear, A-U-R-A-L. And my dear friend Ross Gay and I have had many conversations in the past about poetry as a bodily art and how you feel it and where is it coming from? If we want to use ancient language, right? What part of the humors is a poem coming from?
Yeah.
But the gut, the body, the shoulders, obviously the breathing over and over again through a poem.
Yeah. Do you enjoy doing live poetry readings? I know some poets, it's not their preferred vehicle of sharing their poetry. Hearing what you just said, I can imagine what your answer might be, but how do you approach live poetry readings? Do you enjoy it? How do you prepare for it?
Yes, I enjoy it a great deal. I am not a spoken word poet. I'm not a performance poet, so I would never claim to have their great abilities. But to write a poem, I have read it aloud hundreds of times before I'm satisfied with it. And I love to go and offer a context. I'm a poet in a live reading context where I want to offer context for the audience so that they are going to understand and enter the poem better. I know some poets, they want to say, no, the poem is just going to function on the page.
Right.
And I respect that. And I do try to write a poem that can do that so that if it's picked up in a journal or somebody picks up my book and they have no idea who I am, maybe they have no idea of the species I'm naming in the poem, they can still enter the poem in a full, rich way. But I love being with people. I considered going into the ministry quite a lot through my teens and 20s. Ultimately knew I could have no part of it because I couldn't stand up and do anything with doctrine or dogma or assurance. I could not offer any kind of assurance and certainly couldn't deal with church politics either.
Yeah.
That's kind of the nice thing with a poem. I can get up with a poem and deliver it in a way that feels like a sacred exchange or a spiritual act with an audience, but I don't feel any pressure to have satisfied anybody's theological doctrine.
I have immense respect for everything you just said. And I was just reminded of, I can't remember where Gary Snyder says it, but somewhere about like we all have to choose the theater that we're willing to engage in. For some, it's the theater of politics. For some, it's the whatever politics, whether it's national or within a church. I like that. That'll be somewhere in our own vocational calling, but to listen carefully that you don't enter the wrong one because that will eat you alive. At least that's been my experience. I would love to, if you don't mind, thinking about what you just shared about reading a poem and then thinking about this birthday that you just had and both you and your son. One of your new poems I was hoping I could ask you to read is Fishing with My 17-Year-Old Self. So looking back on that poem and any context you want to share to tee it up, if you're willing, I would love to hear it.
Sure. This took place at the edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana on a small headwater stream. And a storm came up, and I took shelter on a little island where the stream braided around it. And it was a thick alder, willow, and dogwood thicket, protected me from the rain. And so I will pull the curtain back a little bit further even. Noah was with me, and I have written a nonfiction piece about that. In fact, The Sun published it, I think it was in the February issue. I originally tried to work it as a poem with Noah in the poem with me and realized the poem just was resisting that. And I realized finally that it was because I was seeing more of myself in Noah, which is pretty easy to do when a child is born on your 30th birthday, and he and I look quite a lot alike. I was seeing so much of myself there, that 17-year-old self in him. He was around that age when we had this experience together. But nonfiction, it didn't resist it at all. And that's the wonderful thing about working in two different genres. I was able in the nonfiction piece to go in and have the two of us. And there were entirely different concerns in the nonfiction piece than in this poem. So,
Well, I'll be sure to link to that article in The Sun so folks can get a chance to read both of them.
Yeah. So this is called Fishing with My 17-Year-Old Self. We wade upstream where light marks the passage, open and forgiving. So when rain begins, wind and thunder growling over the peak whose base forms the foundation of this stream, we're more surprised than scared. A game trail leads us into a willow thicket, spit of rock and dirt pushed up by 100-year floods, a small island with moving water on all sides. water also moving from darker skies, stuffed full of young aspen and alder. Limbs and leaves lay tight as shingles on a roof. And here, in our green hovel, dry and comfortable, we rest, backs propped on slender trunks, eyes closed, listening to what now seems far off weather. The arterial thrush of the river grows, and when I open my eyes, your face glistens, faint nimbus exposing the first evidence of mustache and chin beard. You're still young enough to sleep anywhere, and my own old worries have receded as a softer wind pushes clouds, slivers of sun beginning to unspool wet branches. A returned warmth hatches flies, and kingfisher rile the air with their clicking mantra. A bear rustles willow shoots 50 yards downstream. Rather than wake you and go back to tempting cutthroat with figured lines, I wait a bit longer. Shelter in this country, the same way I saved leaves to press in a book as a boy.
Thank you, Todd. What is it like to hold that memory of that time with Noah, and also thinking about yourself as that teenager in this moment, in this time? And what I believe Bob Marshall Wilderness is the most remote wilderness in the lower 48. Is that correct?
I'm not sure how they'd
calculate that, but
yes, I assume it is.
Yeah.
I spend time in 3 different wildernesses there in Montana every single summer with field research, and one of them's the Rattlesnake Wilderness, one of them is the Bob Marshall, which is enormous and sprawls, and another one is the Anaconda Pentler Wilderness, and they're just all such valuable jewels in our diminishing wildness here. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I write poems for a range of different reasons. If I went back to my 20-something-year-old self who started to write poems, trying to write them seriously, trying to say, okay, this is a vocation, and that started around the age of 26. If I go back to that person, that writer, so many of the poems were trying to capture moments that I didn't want to see slip away. Because even at that age, I could see, yes, for my parents, something that happened 40 years before, it was hard for them to conjure every detail or to really feel it. But at my age, at 26, I was like, yeah, how well do I remember something that happened at 12 to me or at 14 to me? And I realized that was one of the gifts that poetry could provide, that it was different than a photo, a snapshot, and it certainly can encompass everything. Just like photography, there's a frame, there's perspective, what's left inside the frame, what's left outside the frame. There's the singular perspective. I can't take on the perspective of all creatures, but you can at least try through imagination to walk around the scene and take on different perspectives. And with drafts, have more things in the frame that you may have to revise out. But that was a true gift that I wanted at 26. And so a poem like that I wrote, probably 3 years ago, I bet, 3 or 4 years ago. So, at 56, 57, I still value that as one of the things a poem can do.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm just being struck by all these things coming together from one of your previous answers about, one of your favorite pastimes with your family is walking through the woods and paying attention. And then also, as you were saying, like, what's framed in a poem? What's the different perspectives? And I think this is something that I find similar in at least how I understand Wendell Berry's approaches about going into the woods, his woods, and paying attention. And I find that very similar with you, but then also the number of perspectives that you bring in through your poetry, I find sets you apart from Berry. And that overlapping kinship, I feel like I find all these connections between poets I admire. And then where I hear them diverge is part of their particularity that I get to just enjoy and see as their own pathway. And I don't know of any other poet who can emphasize and embody a perspective better than you. Like, I think you are able to get inside these creatures, these characters, sometimes in unbelievable ways, but so grounded that they're more than believable. How is that kind of that? How have you grown into that perspective shifting as a poet? Because you write poems that I know no one else could. Like, there's a certain Todd Davis poem. And I think once you enter a world where your poetry holds that capacity and caliber, it puts you in a different echelon of poets. So how did you work on that perspective shifting, that interior launching of awareness?
We were talking, I think, before we started recording about Amy Leach and how much I like her work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about what an interesting path to create her personhood, right? Born and raised in Texas in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, what fundamentalism and authoritarianism did to her, and eventually how she moves away from that. And I'm very interested in how that happens to people in general, but artists especially. I'm interested in their life stories and how that happens. And of course, when it's happening to you, maybe there are some artists that, no, I just thought, no, I'm just a weird kid. That's the simple answer. I'm just the weird kid growing up in a factory town in northern Indiana. What I didn't know, and right, nature versus nurture. I have no idea how much of this would have happened if I had had another existence. So I can't speak to the nature part of it. I can speak to the nurture part of it. I had two wonderfully loving parents who, my mom could not remember the name of a tree to save her life, whereas my father was very good with field identification, having grown up. They both grew up in backwoods Appalachia, my mom in Virginia and my father in Kentucky. But my father knew the woods quite well. He was a veterinarian, and that's where the nurture part. My earliest memories are of being in the animal hospital. I have a memory of probably being 4 or 5 years old where a dog is delivering pups and my father's handing them to me to rub down, with a blanket. My parents loved to tell this story. My mom did. And my mother was very decorous, but she loved to tell the story that how I found out about the birds and the bees, where she and I were out. We had gone to pick up some chickens that we were going to pluck and from another farm and create fryers. But there was a bull mounting a cow, a heifer, and she stopped because I was amazed. What are these two creatures doing? And so I learned about the birds and the bees. And so to answer your question directly about maybe perspectives, first, I've never been a person of great confidence that I have the answer.
Mm-hmm.
I am a doubter, but not a doubter where some doubters, it takes away all of your confidence in what you might think or believe. And I'm grateful I never struggled with that, because I've had friends who have struggled with that, where you're trying to help them constantly go, you are fantastic. Your perceptions are wonderful. Share them. And no, the confidence is all gone. That did not plague me. But my wife of 37 years, Shelley, still laughs at me because she knows if she asks me, did you do X, Y, or Z? Or is what you just said accurate? Even if I know it is, even if I've just read it or just done the act, all she has to do is ask, are you sure? And I'll be like, well, no, I don't know if I am. And that's true with faith for me. I have a strong feeling there is a higher power. And I love the mystery that all the ways we would try to name God, the higher power, whatever that means, I can immediately, the minute that's out of my mouth, go, But I understand exactly how an agnostic or an atheist could have their positions, and those seem perfectly legitimate too. And I can imagine myself into that. So imagining myself across human experiences is one thing. And I think it's in part being that odd elementary school boy who was picked on and bullied. And it was also that same boy that was constantly with sick animals that we were trying to heal, or sick animals that would eventually die. Later on in the practice, I would help in all kinds of ways at the animal hospital, but one of my main chores was to bury the bodies of dead animals out in we called it the Paupers Cemetery. It was out near railroad tracks, just out past a spit of land in a swamp, near a swamp behind the animal hospital. And so just being with these animals constantly, I would crawl into into a bottom cage with a large dog and just cuddle up to it. And I'm not saying I'm a dog whisperer, but I would speak to them in the language I had, and I would try to listen. How are they trying to communicate back? What does the sickness mean to them? How are they experiencing sickness? And so then, later, and we had we had 40 acres of woods just over the line in Michigan, but encountering other than human animals in these wild spaces beyond the domesticated space of animals, and trying to think about their lives constantly. It came naturally. It wasn't like I had to go, I want to think about what a barred owl's life is like. It was my parents, their awe for the natural world influenced me. And so I was in awe, and I wanted to read everything I could, and I wanted to go back and listen to the barred owl or see it fly out over my head.
Thank you for sharing that. And it reminds me of one of your poems. I'm wondering if I could ask you to read April Prayer when I think about all that you just shared about that connection to animals as they're passing and what to view things from their perspective. And even as you were talking about mystery and God and faith and what it may be and the times in which we hedge of what that actually could be, this poem sprang to mind as kind of been one of my favorites in this new collection. Yeah, thank you.
You bet. And I'll just say, it saddens me, we have extirpated most of our apex predators here in the Northeast. And so we don't have a population of mountain lions here, although locals like to say that there are. Sometimes we have a migrating mountain lion come through, obviously an exotic pet that is let loose and shouldn't be.
Right.
So we have black bear, who are going to predate on fawns, for example, when they drop here in the spring. We have bobcats, we have coyotes. And coyotes are demonized here, and it makes me very sad. I think they're a beautiful creature, and they're so necessary to our ecosystem health, and they're so smart. And then, of course, I love all of the stories that we have from indigenous peoples of the coyote as trickster. So this is a poem where I was trying to honor all the beauty I see in them, as well as the beauty that I see in our white-tailed deer population. April Prayer. Where snow disappeared a month ago, I trace my fingers to wake dirt. In darkness, coyotes dragged the carcass of the doe they'd run down into a tangle of rhododendron. If I'm to pray, I must become the thing I pray to. Flesh rent, fur reformed into tufts of hair like the fans my aunts wave under their chins in church. My lips scoured by uninterrupted light. Not a single tree leafed out. Just words and empty air. For that deer and those coyotes. For the beauty of the devoured and the ones who devour.
Thank you, Todd. And you may have noticed, I'm asking you to read some of the new poems from this collection because I know from those listening, and this is our third chance to talk, that we have talked about some of your previous work, including coffin honey and native species. and that this latest collection is new and selected poems. And so it's fun to hear you read these new poems that are newer to me, and I'm sure for those listening, as this collection draws from the past, but also what's been most emerging. And this feels momentous to me, like to have a new and this collection, because if I had my druthers, the day this book came out, I would have loved to have recorded a conversation with you and put it out. But life did not allow that for me. But I have finally forgiven myself for that and hope you do as well. But there's an evergreenness to your work. Like the morning dew is still wet on each poem. And when I look over this collection, I recognize that this is 25 years-ish of published poems. And I kind of stumble for words about how to hold this. Like there's a consistent spirit throughout that I so enjoy watching it ebb and flow, and I think grow and expand in ways that are artistically delightful. Did you ever think that you would have this many books of poetry out at this stage, and that you would be at this point where you bring in some of the past with the new emerging work? I mean, this feels like a huge accomplishment as a poet. How do you sit with these kind of like epochs of not just the internal spirit of how that affects you, but like as a poet to reach this stage in your career? It's really remarkable to me.
I feel so fortunate, so lucky. I feel so fortunate that I found a press like Michigan State University Press who stuck with me. So few poets get to have that experience these days. Most books are published through single book competitions, and it's usually a one-off, so that you end up with a press for one book and then you're searching yet again. I have a friend who's in his 70s who had won the Miller-Williams Prize. He had won the Birdsong Prize from University of Wisconsin Press. Miller-Williams is from the University of Arkansas Press, publishes in all of the best journals, is a fantastic poet. And suddenly, for 2 books, he just couldn't find anybody. He eventually did, but they were much smaller presses. He was thankful that they published the work, but it took so long. Thankfully, he just won the Miller-Williams Prize last year for his book, Barley Child. His name is Greg Rapley. Fantastic poet. And I was just so thrilled to see this and to see his perseverance, that he would continue to work so hard at what he was writing. And so I daily pinch myself and say a word of thanks, because I know it is a very privileged position to have Michigan State support the work. They have published 7 books of my poetry and then 1 anthology of nonfiction that I did on basketball. It's called Fast Break to Line Break, Poets on the Art of Basketball, poets all writing creative nonfiction on that subject. But yes, I feel so fortunate. And then to answer your earlier question, I couldn't believe it when I got my first book of poems published. It was published by Bottom Dog Press in Ohio. Larry Smith was the editor-publisher. That press continues to this day. And I remember, I think I was 35. The book was published when I was 37, but I was 35 when I think he said yes. And I just couldn't believe I'd even have 1 book of poems in the world. And then Michigan State published Some Heaven. So that was 2002 for my very first book. And there was a 5-year gap, but Michigan State published my second book, Some Heaven, in 2007. And I had a dear friend, Dinty Moore. He's a pretty well-known creative nonfiction writer. And he was a colleague. And I said, Dinty, I just can't believe this. And I said, do you think they would publish another book of mine? And Dinty looked at me, he said, Todd, you write good poems. Dinty's a very practical guy. He said, you write good poems, and you're a good literary citizen. Why wouldn't they want to publish another book of yours? But when you look at the statistical odds in the poetry world, and I didn't get into any debate with Dinty, I just thought, I'm glad Dinty thinks so, but do you want to talk about real doubt? I had real doubt.
Yeah.
And so from book to book, I've just felt so fortunate. And then I am very much a process person. And maybe that, I think it comes out of being the son of a veterinarian and the grandson of farmers. Before that, maternal grandfather moved to Connecticut to work in that rubber factory. He had farmed through the Depression with his parents. Farming is a daily act. Healing and caring for animals is a daily act. Being an athlete is a daily act. You don't train, once a month. It's a daily act. And so I think, from my past conversations with you, Zen Buddhism, I would not call myself a Buddhist, but many of the practices within Zen Buddhism are things that I incorporate into my own spiritual life. And that dailiness, that presence, all of that has come together so that if I'm not working on writing, and most often poems, every single day, at least for an hour or so, things seem totally off kilter. And so it was an odd act to put together this new and selected, but that was the main thing that hit home, that, of course, Todd, because you do this every day. It mounts. It's not that there's anything special about you, Todd. It's that if you have a practice, no matter who you are, there will be a mounting body of work that is left behind you.
Yes. And I so appreciate the way you talk about it as practice. Because everything you mentioned takes a disciplined practice to, and I also think that I hear that in the way you talk about your family too. Like, what does it mean to be a father? What does it mean to be a spouse? And it's interesting to me because I was revisiting, I also got to say, another great cover. Like, your covers are the best covers. I was revisiting Ditch Memory as we hit Ash Wednesday in the Christian liturgical season. And as for those that don't know, Ash Wednesday is the beginning of Lent, where we put ashes on our body. That great reminder from the book of Genesis, from dust to dust. And your poems remind me of that blessing of origin, of life, and of return to the earth. And we do that by marking our bodies with ash. And I feel like your poems are marked with ash, remembering that cycle. And so that's Ditch Memory to me. So with that in mind, I'm wondering, as you talk about these different disciplines, these different practices that you engage on a daily basis, what does that discipline or ritual of writing poetry look like for you? How do you shape that in any sort of ritualistic way as a way to enter that space of bringing forth these life-giving, ashy poems?
So first off, I know for some, it could be a sad or grievous or depressing thing to say, we will all be dust. Everything we do will become dust. That doesn't seem sad to me at all. And especially not if you put it in the context of what we do know through our scientific exploration, that all energy is being transformed all the time. That doesn't seem to be a sad thing. What will be a poem 5,000 years from now? If my poems are dust, is something in the transformation of the energy of my body or the energy of the pulp that was made to create the paper, right? And the print on these pages. But how is that going to be transformed? That is of more interest and celebration to me than to grieve that we will all be dust and all that we do will be dust. I think it's real helpful for humility as well. Right? That I can remember as an undergrad in a class, Percy Shelley's poem, Ozymandias, right? And it's like, well, yeah, of course. And there's no grief over this because, yeah, at one point, amazing, famous, politically powerful, full of riches. You'll be dust too. It's a nice leveling effect.
Yes, it is.
But as far as my practice goes, I had speech therapy as a kid all through elementary school. I had trouble with THs and some other words. And so once a day, I went to the speech therapist. And it was an old school. It had been built in the 1920s. And the speech therapist and I were honestly in a little closet no windows. It was the most narrow room, but that's where she would come and do her work. I think the difficulty I had in pronouncing words led to my valuing of words.
Hmm.
I think that relates to my potentially coming to the practice of trying to make poems, but also I was so impressed with my father and grandfather when they could walk through the woods and name different trees or name different flowers, name different plants, and then talk about our relationship to them based on uses. Here's something you could forage. Here's the blossom. Remember where that blossom is? Because by the time the berry appears, a lot of these very small plants that are at ground level right now will start to encroach, and you may not be able to find where this thicket is unless you mark it now with the blossom, as opposed to just coming to search for the berry. Medicinal uses for plants, all of that. And so the biggest act for me in writing, and this is true for my nonfiction too, but definitely for the poems, is the naming of the world.
Mm.
And I see it as an act of relationship. And it's no different than, you said about like with fatherhood or being a good partner or spouse. It's fine to say, and we use the word love a lot in our family. I loved you. You're wonderful. You're great. You're so special. But none of that matters if there aren't the accompanying actions through the day that show that care, that show, I really value that you can do that, or I really value your presence because of this. And the way I'm acting towards you shows that. A lot of people say that they love the earth and they want to save it. I really don't say this to be judgmental. I say it to say, maybe wake up to this fact, you can practice it too, which is, if you really love something, don't you know its name? If you really love something, don't you want to learn more about it? If I say I love a person, then I hope I don't forget their name, and I should be asking them questions about all kinds of things in their life. And shouldn't I do that for this wildflower? Or shouldn't I do this for that tree? Or shouldn't I do this for this muskrat that I just saw swim by? Or if I find, this is from a very old poem, but if I find along the river in the deep snow in February, these tracks of urine, tracks leading to different urine set down at periodic places with blood in it, to find out that, of course, this is when the mink is in estrus and rut, laying down this scent pattern. Shouldn't I learn those things? Because that's what we do when we have a friend, when we have a beloved.
Mm-hmm.
We want to know more about the beloved, and we want to call them by name.
I couldn't agree with you more. And this background, for any reader or soon-to-be reader of your poetry, will see the mind and heart and body that creates these poems and where it comes from, because it is in that belovedness, in that ecology of friendship, of place. And you communicate that so well. And I also love the ecology of friendship. Last time we spoke, we talked about Dave Shoemate, another poet of note who's worth one's time and energy. And then today I want to mention too that the preface, the foreword for Ditch Memory was written by another David, your pal, David James Duncan, author of Sun House, among other notable books. It's an incredible tee up to your work. Really, you can tell how much respect and joy that Duncan has received from your work and lived with it. What can you tell me about your relationship with James Duncan as a friend, as a fellow artist who works from a place and from a sense of place? Yeah, I would just love to hear any reflective tones you might have on that.
So David's work has meant so much to me since I may have just graduated from undergrad in the 80s, or maybe it was 1 year out when I read The River Why.
Mm-hmm.
And all his work has meant so much to me. Our mutual friend, Chris Dombrowski, who is a literary executor for David, he's who put me in touch with David. Because I said to Chris, David's work has meant so much to me for so long. And it was my third book that was coming out, the least of these. And Chris said, "Oh, I think David would really like your poems. Send him a copy. Here's his address. Send him a copy." And so I did. Trepidation, of course, and shyness because of what I felt he accomplished in his writing was so great. And it's like, but I'm going to do this because that's how you start friendships or conversations, potentially. I expected, because this happens a lot when you send things off. Either you hear nothing or a nice note. "Thanks for sending the book. Congrats and wishing you good success." And that's it. Instead, I have in my files over here, it was an 8-page letter where he had, not every poem in the book, but I think it was a good 20 poems where he would write the title and then write a paragraph back to me about what that poem did for him and write another title, so on. And I was just thunderstruck by that. And we had never met. And I think it was probably still another 4 or 5 years before we met in Missoula, had dinner together. But he's just been such a good friend to my poems in this way. And so when he agreed to write this forward to the book, it was an incredible gift. His writing, everything from the novels, but to nonfiction books like God Laughs and Plays, means so much to me. His reverence and irreverence strikes such a chord with me. And it is the way I feel about things too. I tend not to openly verbalize the irreverence as much as David does, but my family members would tell you I can be very irreverent. And yet at the same time, just like David, I can break down and weep over a moment. And it's the sacred and profane, which I don't see as separate. I know we have this dichotomous language for them in English. I see them, if I was seeing them, it would be just like the yin and yang. In other words, the profane is always oozing into the sacred, and the sacred is always oozing into the profane. In grad school, I had a course on Yeats with a wonderful old professor, and Crazy Jane Talks to the Archbishop is one of my favorite poems. What is the line? "Nothing can be soul or whole that has not been rent, like torn apart." And again, I know based on my background with the farming and the veterinarian work, of course, it's a sacred act to clean up the offal of this sick animal and to tend to them. And that's why I think of all the people in all the healing professions for human and non-human animals, right? Cleaning up the bedpan, wiping out the bed sore. On one hand, I understand why people with these bodily moments that can smell awful and make you retch, they can feel like, oh, I want to deny this somehow. I want to embrace it and say, that is as wonderful as the smell of a new baby's head after you've bathed it. Yeah. And think about the cares. I know you're a dad, right? Giving a bath and smelling how good that clean scent is after the bath is wonderful. But there's something wonderful also about cleaning up that diaper and trying to care for the child. So I love the sacred and profane in David's work. And Sun House is a book that just knocked my socks off. I was so happy when that novel came out and that journey through with those people. And so many times I found myself just laughing uncontrollably. And then the next moment, just weeping and weeping as I lived with those characters.
Oh, so true for me as well. Yeah, Sun House was a powerhouse book. And those characters still, I mean, just like some of your poems, like we were talking about, these poems that stick around, they stick to your ribs. There's characters that do that as well. And so it came as no surprise to me that you and David were friends. And I love the way that he teed up your work so well. And one thing that he notes in the foreword is that you are both absorbers of Douglas Chatwick's seminal book, 4/5 a Grizzly. And I don't know that book, but once I understood the premise, I began to see its influence on your work, particularly of our poetic friend Ursus, the black bear who repeatedly shows up in Coffin Honey and also in some of the new poems. How did 4/5 a Grizzly find you? Well, first maybe I should ask, can you share with those listening what the premise is or some of the key notes of that is? And then how did that book find you?
So this book is really just a compilation of the science that we have out there. And, I teach in environmental studies here, and one of the main people I team teach with is Dr. Carolyn Mahan, and she is a biologist. She's a mammologist, does work on, at the present moment, she's very interested in looking at why in certain places in Europe, like in Italy, the population has lived in a different relationship with wolves and grizzly bears there, brown bears, compared to here, especially in the American West. And again, as the son of a veterinarian, we were talking about my dear cat Whiskers, who I just put to rest, planted her out here in our backyard where we always grow cosmos because she loved to go into the jungle of cosmos every summer. So cosmos will be growing out of her body. Her energy will be transformed into those flowers this summer. Intuitively or instinctively, based on the way I grew up, as well as in church, I loved the sermons about St. Francis. And then as I got older, when I found out he was a heretic in the church, he was kicked out of the church, that he became a saint much later. And what was the cause of this? He believed animals had souls. And I've written about this elsewhere. I think I was in the 4th grade when we had a Potawatomi tribal member come to our elementary school and talk to us. And this Potawatomi tribal member was explaining to the class that, well, we are kin to all creatures. And so this notion of a word like human that would only be special to us, no, that there are 4-legged humans. Maybe a deer is a 4-legged human, right? This whole notion of separation that, of course, comes down through a Western cosmology, it had missed me because in my church, we heard about St. Francis, and there wasn't this sense that no, animals wouldn't have souls. And certainly working with my father or even my grandfather on his farm, they acknowledged repeatedly animals had incredible intelligence. They had emotions. They had distinct personalities. That, yes, you could talk about generalized characteristics within a species, but the wonderful thing is science could generalize to create a taxonomy. But the minute you started looking at individuals, every individual seemed to flaunt the specific general things that were supposed to be just hard and fast rules. And so in this book, what it's looking at is now with microbiology, and my daughter-in-law is a microbiologist, we can see the genetic material and how much of it we share. And so that's why 4/5 of grizzly, the notion that we are so genetically close to so many other creatures. And then I'm also interested in the science that shows us how little of our body is our own. So our gut life, right? The microbial gut life, or
Yes.
what is on our skin. So much of what we think is ours again is actually shared by other creatures, other species. And again, maybe that scares somebody if they have to have this idea of a singular and distinct, and I'm special, as opposed to a more communal approach to life, which is even my body is shared with other creatures. And my DNA, there's more in common with the other creatures than there is distinct about us. And that leads to me, to want to write their stories and try to imagine myself into those places. I find human animals interesting. I will write a poem out of my own life, but I'm so much more interested in so many other lives. And all of this comes full circle with my faith life. I loved starting in probably around 4th grade in the Presbyterian church I grew up in to hear about the body of Christ. And so
Yes.
it doesn't seem to be counterintuitive at all. It seems intuitive. Of course, it's just like the body of Christ. We're all connected and we all do different things within it.
Amen. I'm so with you on that. I think that is an underutilized image and metaphor and way of metaphysical reality connecting us all. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind reading The Bear Inside the Bear, as we've been talking about grizzlies and black bears. Another top shelf poem from your your new ones.
Sure. And so I've been writing about Ursus, but for a long time. But in fact, there's a poem. It might be in Winterkill. It's called "The Poet Stumbles Upon a Buddha in Gamelands 158 above the village of Tipton," and it was about coming across a black bear that I end up naming Ursus later in a collection like Coffin Honey. But he had what's called Devil's Walking Stick or Hercules Club, bent down to the ground and was just raking the fruit in September into his mouth and having a grand time. So with this poem, The Bear Inside the Bear, a new poem here in this collection, I was thinking about Ursus's mother, who also appears in Coffin Honey, and about her being pregnant with Ursus. So, The Bear Inside the Bear. Within the womb of his mother's making, the bear inside the bear wakes and walks the curved space of the world he inhabits. Her veins spread across the dim red sky like beech limbs full of copper leaf flutter. The world outside the world the bear must walk into changes. Ice melts under blood's thrumming. Snow turns to rain. Ursus's mother knows the passage of time is mercy, a prayer of acceptance. She can't help but hope the men and women who destroy the world will be turned into trees, bodies bridged with bark, arms cleft in contrition, chests slashed open like the canopy when a tree is thrown by wind, sun allowed to fall into darkness again. And I'm fascinated by genetics. I'm also fascinated by the fact that, right, nothing is not born of a mother. And the whole notion that Ursus's mother's womb was created in a womb before her. The womb of her mother's making. That Ursus's mother, and I don't know if we think about that often, so and these things, as you can tell, just fascinate me, leave me in awe, that the womb I was born in was actually made within the womb of my grandmother. And I was lucky to know that grandmother. She's the one who taught me to fish, and we had such a dear relationship. I called her Nanny, and just a fantastic woman. She was born and raised in the Appalachians of Virginia, and she was a fabulous woman. And I just loved the fact that the womb that gave me life was created in her womb.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me. I so appreciate the way you speak of lineage in your poetry and ancestors, and also there's the spirit of becoming an esteemed ancestor yourself. How do you pass this along in this great chain of being so it doesn't become this, well, now's my opportunity to rake in as much as possible, but I am a part of this cycle of birth, life, and death, and then back to the earth for more life. And I think you do it in such creative ways that I'm often kind of left just with a pause. Like, The Bear Inside the Bear is a poem that I just want to take with me on walks and let different lines kind of just chew on me instead of me chew on them. Because there is these there's the journey itself of the poem, but then there's snippets within. The passage of time is mercy, and these things that just feel very meditative for consideration. And so, yeah, I can't say it enough. I'm such a fan of your work, Todd, and Ditch Memory is a great piece to add to the collection. I'm going to ask you to read one more poem, if that's okay, if you have time to do so. Because, again, I feel like your poems hold different expressions in different directions while holding a particular center. I got a kick out of, well, also, I think holding in its totality, the poem, A Friend Writes to Me to tell me how Hildegard of Bingen cried veritas. I never know how to say that word. Do you know how to say? Is it veritas?
That's how I say it, but I could be wrong too.
Yeah. This poem, you bring the sensual, you bring the earthy. There's nothing from life that feels out of bounds in your poetry. And to look with unflinching, open eyes and grace to it. And there's a mystic sight in that I so appreciate. I'd love to ask you to read that poem if you have time to read one more.
Absolutely. I'm thinking of my dear wife, Shelley, here towards the end of the poem as I'm writing this. But this friend, I would love to name her here. It's Mary Rose O'Reilly. I think Mary is 82 now. I just got a letter from her last week. I taught her book, Barn at the End of the World, when I was at Goshen College teaching. It was published by Milkweed. She didn't publish her first poetry collection until she was 63. She won a first book prize. LSU published it, but Mary Oliver was the judge that year. She has several nonfiction collections, though, too. I know at least two of them are with Milkweed. A Quaker, Zen Buddhist, but raised as a Roman Catholic, as you would guess, Irish Catholic, with Mary Rose O'Reilly. She taught at the University of St. Thomas most of her life. But she literally wrote me a letter when the cause this poem to be written, where she was quoting Hildegard of Bingen about veritas. So thank you, Mary Rose. A friend writes to tell me how Hildegard of Bingen cried veritas. A shoe thrown, an axle broken by stone, the horse plods on, searching for a creek to drink from. Doesn't the wood of the violin, even when splintered, remember the first notes played? Stars descend through ascending smoke. 2 mountains removed, the green flames of the first summer fires glow. We're downwind in the dark, downriver swimming naked, your hand on my back, mine reaching for your front, the God of light still hours away.
Thank you, Todd. You have a poem for every occasion and for the daily life, the discipline of facing our own mortality and our own joy and our own relationships. I'm so grateful for your work. And maybe you remember this, but I always like to close our conversations by asking the guest, if you were going to pair our conversation with a drink, what would be your drink of choice and why?
You may remember I'm a big tea drinker. So
yes.
My most recent concoction is the Celestial Seasonings Sleepy Time with the Twinnings Peach Orange. I put those two together with just a dab of honey in them to sip before I go to sleep. So I would go to sleep and dream of this good conversation, and I really thank you for doing this.
I love it, Todd, and I do look forward to the day. I know it will happen where we will get to clink tea glasses and talk more, because it's always a joy, and I want to do it in person one of these days.
Let's go for a hike together.
That would be amazing. Thank you for listening to this episode of Contemplify. May it stir conversation with kindred spirits and strangers alike, and provide a nourishing morsel of thought for your week. Slip over to contemplify.com to find the show notes for this episode. While you're there, sign up for the monthly Contemplify non-required reading list and the weekly contemplative practice, Lo-Fi and Hushed. If you're enjoying Contemplify, rate and review it on your podcast player. The president of the internet slipped me a note just the other day on a napkin that said, "This will help spread the contemplative cheer." The theme song of Contemplify is called Langside by Charles Enns and Darren Hovius. Fellas, grateful as always. And I'm looking forward to bringing you more musings and conversations with contemplatives in the world here in the near future. Until then, be well.